Who was the first man to reach South Pole? Ronald Amundsen. Who was the first man to climb Mount Everest? Sherpa Tenzing Edmund Hillary. Who was the first man to reach North Pole? Robert Peary. Who was the first man to win Nobel Prize for Physics? W. K. Roentgen. Who was India's first man in space? Rakesh Sharma. Who was first man to win Nobel Prize for Chemistry? J. H. Van 't Hoff. Who was the first President of Indian Republic? Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Who was Pakistan's first Governor General? Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Who was the first man to set foot on the moon? Neil Armstrong. Who was the first Indian to win Nobel Prize? Rabindranath Tagore. Who was the first Indian Air Chief Marshal? S. Mukherjee. Who was the first man to fly an aeroplane? Wright brothers. Who was the first Indian pilot? J. R. D. Tata. Who was the first Secretary General of United Nations? Tregveli. Who was the first ethnic Indian Prime Minister of Fiji? Mahendra Chaudhary. Who was the first President of the Republic of China? Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Who was the first European invader of Indian soil? Alexander the Great. Who was the first man to go into space? Major Yuri Gagarin. Who was the first American president to visit India? Dwight David Eisenhower. Who was the first man to walk in space? Alexei Leonov. Who was the first European to visit China? Marco Polo. Who was the first man to draw the map on Earth? Anaximander. Who was the first person to sail around the world? Ferdinand Magellan. Who was the first man to hit double century in one-day international? Sachin Tendulkar. Who was the first Muslim president of India? Dr. Zakir Hussain. Who was the first Governor General of independent India? Lord Louis Mountbatten. Who was the first Governor General of India? William Bentinck. Who was the first President of National Congress? Vyomkesh Chandra Banerjee. Who was the first Home Minister of India? Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Who was the first Prime Minister of India who resigned before the full term? Morarji Desai. Who was the first Judge of International Court of Justice? Dr. Nagendra Singh. Who was the first Governor of Reserve Bank of India? Sir Osborne Smith. Who was the first Indian to join ICS? Satyendranath Tagore. Who was the first man to introduce printing press? James Hickey. Who was the Field Marshal of India? SHFJ Manekshaw. Who was the first Indian Commander-in-Chief of India? General Cariappa. Who was the first Chief of Air Staff? Air Marshal Sir Thomas Almrist. Who was the first Chief of Army Staff? General Maharaj Rajendra Singh. Who was the first Indian to get Nobel Prize in Physics? C.V. Raman. Who was the first Indian Naval Chief? Vice Admiral R.D. Katari. Who was the first Indian Air Chief Marshal? Subrata Mukherjee. Who was the first sports person to receive Bharat Ratna? Sachin Tendulkar. Who was the first person of Indian origin to get Nobel Prize? Hargab Gobind Khurana. Who was the first Indian to get Grammy Award? Pandit Ravi Shankar. Who was the first person to get Paramveer Chakra? Major Somnath Sharma. Who was the first Indian to receive Bharat Ratna Award? Dr. Radhakrishnan. Who was the first person to receive Gyanpith Award? Sir Sankar Kurup. Who was the first person to reach Mount Everest without oxygen? Sherpa Enga Dorji. Who was the first Indian to swim across the English Channel? Mihir Sen. Who was the first Indian to score triple century in Test cricket? Virendra Sehwag.